The sun beat down mercilessly on Pete's auto shop, where the sound of wrenches clicking and engines humming filled the air. Ray Thompson had built this place from nothing, turning it into the most trusted garage in the small town of Pine Grove. His weathered hands told stories of countless hours spent under car hoods, but his greatest pride wasn't the business, it was his 16-year-old daughter, Amy. Amy grew up surrounded by the symphony of tools and machinery, learning to distinguish a carburetor from a catalytic converter before she could ride a bike. She inherited her father's natural talent for mechanics, but also her mother's gentle spirit. After losing her mom to illness 3 years ago, Amy became Ray's whole world, and he became even more protective of her. What the locals knew about Ray's past could fit on a post-it note. He'd moved to Pine Grove 12 years ago, opened the shop, and raised his daughter as a single father after his wife's passing. What they didn't know was that before becoming a small-town mechanic, Ray had served as a Navy SEAL, completing missions in places whose names he couldn't even mention. The peaceful routine of their lives began to shift one sweltering Tuesday afternoon when a group of motorcycles thundered into town. The Black Serpents, they called themselves, led by a man known as Thunder. They weren't your typical weekend warriors, these were hardened riders with a reputation that preceded them across 3 states. The bikers rolled into Pete's auto shop that afternoon, their chrome-plated machines gleaming under the harsh sun. Amy was at the front desk, working on inventory while her father handled a timing belt replacement in the garage. Thunder, a mountain of a man with arms covered in faded tattoos, approached the counter with an air of calculated confidence. "Need some work done on these beauties," he announced, gesturing to the row of motorcycles outside. His eyes lingered a moment too long on Amy, who maintained her professional composure despite her unease. She'd dealt with all types of customers before, but something about these men felt different. Ray emerged from under a Toyota, wiping his hands on a shop rag. His trained eye had already assessed the situation through the garage windows, noting the positions of each biker, their body language, the subtle signs that spoke of concealed weapons. Old instincts never really die, they just hibernate. "I'll take care of it, sweetheart," Ray said, his voice carrying a warmth that only his daughter ever heard. "Why don't you head to the library? You mentioned wanting to get started on that history project." It wasn't a suggestion, it was an exit strategy, one of many contingency plans he'd drilled into her over the years. Amy gathered her things, aware of the tension crackling in the air like static before a storm. As she left, Thunder's right-hand man, a lean figure who went by Scratch, made a show of holding the door open for her. Ray watched the interaction with the calculated patience of a man who'd learned to read threats in the smallest of gestures. The rest of the afternoon passed in a dance of carefully chosen words and measured responses as Ray inspected their bikes. He found evidence of long-distance travel, modifications that weren't strictly legal, and signs that these machines had recently seen more action than just highway miles. The Black Serpents didn't leave town that evening. Instead, they took up residence at the Pine Grove Motel, their presence casting a shadow over the usually quiet community. Ray noticed them circling past the shop multiple times over the next few days, their interest poorly disguised as casual rides. What they didn't realize was that while they were watching his daughter, Ray was watching them. Each pass they made, each lingering glance, was noted and catalogued with the precision of a man who'd once tracked targets through much more hostile territories. He recognized the signs of surveillance, the patterns of people planning something. The question wasn't if they would make a move, but when. As Friday approached, Ray began implementing countermeasures so subtle that even Amy didn't notice. He adjusted their routine, varied their schedules, and made quiet calls to old contacts who owed him favors, the kind of debts that don't expire. In his garage office, behind a loose panel in the wall, a metal box waited. Inside lay remnants of his previous life, credentials that never expired, equipment that never lost its utility, and connections that could never be severed. The bikers had chosen their target without understanding a crucial fact: they weren't dealing with just any small-town mechanic. They were about to learn that some men leave their past behind not because they have to, but because they choose to, until someone gives them a reason to remember who they once were. The weekend arrived with an unusual quiet settling over Pine Grove. Ray noticed the black serpents had shifted their patterns, becoming less obvious in their surveillance but more focused in their intent. He'd seen this behavior before, the calm before an operation. Their previous drive-bys had been replaced by strategic positioning around town, with members casually stationed at key locations: the diner across from the high school, the gas station on Amy's route home, the coffee shop near the library. Thunder made another appearance at the shop that Saturday morning, this time alone. He brought in his bike for what he claimed was a persistent clicking sound. Ray knew better, the motorcycle was in perfect condition. This was reconnaissance, an excuse to gather information. "Noticed your daughter's good with engines," Thunder commented, leaning against the workbench while Ray pretended to check the bike's timing chain. Rare to see that kind of talent in someone so young. The serpents could use a skilled mechanic on our runs. Ray's hands didn't pause in their work, but his mind catalogued every word, every inflection. "She's got her heart set on engineering school," he replied evenly, though his pulse quickened at the implied interest in Amy. "Following her mother's footsteps." Thunder nodded, a calculated smile playing across his face. "Education's important, sure. But real experience? That's priceless. We take care of our own, you know. Like family." The word family, coming from Thunder's lips, made Ray's skin crawl, but years of training kept his expression neutral. He'd heard similar pitches before, in different contexts, in places where the wrong reaction could get you killed. That evening, after closing shop, Ray made a decision. He called Amy's best friend's parents, the Hendersons, arranging for her to spend the night there under the pretense of a study session. Better to have her safely away while he implemented the next phase of his plan. Once Amy was gone, Ray opened the metal box he'd retrieved from behind the wall panel. Inside, among other things, was a small black device, a military-grade tracker he'd maintained from his service days. He worked late into the night, using his cover as a mechanic to plant it carefully on Thunder's bike, disguising it among the genuine repairs. The next morning, Ray discovered what he'd feared: the black serpents had been watching Amy's routine more closely than he'd realized. 3 of their members were parked near the school running track where she usually took her Sunday morning jog, a habit she'd inherited from her mother. But thanks to her stay at the Hendersons, they were watching an empty trail. Ray activated the tracker's receiver, noting their movements. He also noticed something else: the bikers were coordinating through short-range radio, not cell phones. This was organized, professional. They weren't just some random gang, they were running an operation. Through careful observation and the help of his tracker, Ray began to piece together their plan. The serpents had a pattern of recruiting young people with specific skills from small towns across the country. Sometimes these recruits went willingly, lured by promises of adventure and belonging. Other times, well, the missing persons reports in various counties told a different story. What set Amy apart wasn't just her mechanical skills, it was her access. Small-town mechanics saw everything: police vehicles, private security cars, even the occasional federal vehicle passing through. A skilled mechanic could be invaluable to a group operating outside the law. As Sunday afternoon wore on, Ray noticed increased chatter on their radio frequencies. They were planning something for Monday, likely timing it around Amy's usual after-school walk home from tutoring. The route took her past several blind spots in the town security camera network, gaps that Ray had already identified and that the serpents had surely noticed too. He spent that evening making preparations of his own. First, he called his old teammate, Calvin, now working private security 2 towns over. Then he contacted the local sheriff, not to report the bikers, but to casually mention that his security system had been acting up, and could they check the cameras near his shop. It was a subtle way of ensuring extra eyes on the area without tipping his hand. Ray knew he couldn't keep Amy hidden forever, nor did he want to. Running wasn't the answer, it would only teach her to live in fear. Instead, he would turn the hunters into the hunted, using their own tactics against them. But first, he needed to understand exactly what he was dealing with. That night, after ensuring Amy was safely back home, Ray made use of his old skills. Moving silently through the shadows near the Pine Grove Motel, he overheard fragments of conversation through the bikers' open window. They weren't just after Amy, they were planning to use her as leverage to gain Ray's cooperation too. They needed a network of trusted mechanics for their operations, and they thought they'd found the perfect pressure point to establish their first location. What they didn't realize was that every bit of information they gathered about his daughter, every plan they made, only gave Ray more ammunition. As he silently made his way back home, his mind was already formulating countermoves. Tomorrow would be interesting, but not in the way the Black Serpents expected. The pieces were in place. Now it was just a matter of timing. Ray smiled slightly as he checked the tracker one last time before turning in. In his experience, the best traps were the ones where the target never realized they were walking into one until it was too late. Monday morning arrived with an unusual chill despite the summer heat. Ray had spent the night setting his plan in motion, making calls to people who owed him favors from his past life. By dawn, invisible eyes were watching every corner of Pine Grove, though the Black Serpents remained oblivious to the net slowly closing around them. Amy noticed something different about her father at breakfast. Behind his usual calm demeanor, there was an intensity she hadn't seen before. "Dad, is everything okay?" she asked, pushing her cereal around in the bowl. Ray looked at his daughter, seeing so much of her mother in her concerned expression. "Just some challenging repairs at the shop," he said, managing a reassuring smile. "Listen, sweetheart, remember what we always talked about? About being aware of your surroundings?" Amy nodded. Since she was little, her father had taught her to notice details others might miss: exit routes, suspicious behavior, anything out of the ordinary. She'd always thought it was just her father being overprotective, but something in his voice made her realize there was more to those lessons than she'd understood. "Today, I need you to be extra careful," Ray continued, choosing his words carefully. "If anything feels wrong, even slightly, you call me immediately. No questions asked." At school, Amy couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. During lunch break, she spotted one of the serpents, Scratch, parked across the street, pretending to read a newspaper. It wasn't the first time she'd noticed the bikers around town, but today felt different. Her father's warning echoed in her mind. Meanwhile, Ray put the next phase of his plan into action. He discovered through his surveillance that the serpents were running more than just a recruitment operation. They were using their network of mechanics to modify vehicles for drug transportation. The timing of their arrival in Pine Grove coincided with a major federal investigation closing in on their operations in other states. Ray made a show of leaving his shop for a parts run, knowing the serpents were watching. As soon as he was out of sight, he circled back through the alley behind his garage. Through the tracker, he could see 3 of the serpents moving into position near Amy's school, preparing for their afternoon plan. What the serpents didn't know was that Ray's old teammate Calvin hadn't come alone. A small team of private security contractors, all former special operations, had quietly slipped into town overnight. They were now positioned strategically, disguised as construction workers, delivery drivers, and tourists. The real game-changer came when Ray's phone buzzed with a text from an unlisted number. His contact in the FBI had come through with crucial information. Thunder, the Serpent's leader, was wanted in connection with multiple kidnapping cases across state lines. The gang's pattern was always the same: they targeted young people with specific skills, using them to build their criminal network. By early afternoon, Ray had gathered enough evidence through his surveillance to understand their full plan. They intended to take Amy during her walk home from tutoring, using a staged accident as a distraction. Then they would use her as leverage to force Ray's cooperation in their operations. What made Ray's blood run cold wasn't just their plan to take his daughter, it was discovering that this wasn't their first attempt. In his research, he'd uncovered 3 similar cases in other towns, where young mechanics had disappeared, only to resurface months later working in chop shops under the Serpent's control. As the school day progressed, Ray methodically picked apart their plan. He arranged for trusted locals to park their vehicles strategically, eliminating the Serpent's planned escape routes. The sheriff, now subtly aware that something was brewing, had increased patrols in the area without making it obvious they were targeting the bikers. Amy sent her father a text early in the afternoon, "Dad, my tutoring session got cancelled. Coming home early." Ray's heart jumped. This wasn't part of the plan. The Serpents would have to adjust their strategy, which made them more dangerous but also more likely to make mistakes. Through his surveillance, Ray watched the bikers scrambling to adapt to the change. Thunder quickly repositioned his men, but in their haste, they became sloppy. They didn't notice that the delivery van, that had been parked near the school all day, was actually Calvin's team, ready to move at a moment's notice. Ray knew he had to act fast. He couldn't risk the Serpents getting desperate and trying something rash. He made a quick call to Amy, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Sweetheart, I need you to stop by the grocery store on your way home. Pick up some milk, take the long route through Main Street." Amy heard the subtle emphasis in her father's voice and understood. The long route was one of their prearranged safe paths, with plenty of public exposure and security cameras. "Okay, Dad. I'll see you soon." As Amy began her walk, the pieces of Ray's plan started falling into place. The Serpents, forced to abandon their original strategy, were now operating in broad daylight, making them vulnerable. Thunder and his men didn't realize they were no longer the hunters, they had become the prey. Ray watched through his shop window as Amy walked down Main Street, appearing completely normal to anyone watching. But he knew his daughter was following their practiced protocol, alert, aware, and ready to react. The Serpents were about to learn that underestimating this small-town mechanic and his daughter would be their biggest mistake. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Amy made her way to the grocery store. She maintained a steady pace, remembering her father's lessons about not showing fear while staying alert. Through the reflection in store windows, she caught glimpses of the black motorcycles moving parallel to her route, trying to be inconspicuous but failing. Back at the shop, Ray watched the tracker signals converging. Thunder had split his group into 3 teams, 2 bikes following Amy at a distance, 3 men in a newly arrived van circling the block, and Thunder himself with 2 others waiting near the grocery store. Their overconfidence was making them predictable. Ray's phone buzzed, a message from Calvin, "Teams in position." Green light? Ray took a deep breath, checking the security camera feeds he'd accessed. Everything was lined up perfectly. "Execute," he typed back. The first part of Ray's plan unfolded so subtly that even the Serpents didn't notice it happening. The construction crew that had been working on Main Street all morning began packing up their equipment, strategically placing their trucks to narrow the road. Meanwhile, a delivery van broke down near the grocery store, blocking one of the Serpents' planned escape routes. Amy reached the grocery store, the bell chiming as she pushed open the door. Through the store's windows, she saw Thunder and his men pretending to check out the nearby newspaper stand. Her hand tightened around her phone, thumb ready on the speed dial, just as her father had taught her. What happened next seemed like chaos to anyone watching, but it was actually a carefully orchestrated sequence of events. As Amy stepped out of the store with her milk, a school bus pulled up at its regular stop, releasing a crowd of students onto the sidewalk. At the same moment, 2 police cruisers began their routine patrol, having been subtly advised to include Main Street in their route. Thunder's frustration was visible as his perfect setup dissolved into complications. The crowd of students had scattered his men's carefully planned positions, and the police presence meant they couldn't risk anything obvious. Ray watched through his surveillance as Thunder spoke urgently into his radio, trying to salvage their plan. But Ray wasn't done. As the Serpents regrouped, Calvin's team made their move. The broken-down delivery van suddenly came to life, cutting off the Serpents' backup vehicle. At the same time, the construction trucks began moving their equipment again, forcing the bikes to either stop or take a detour down a dead-end street. Amy, following her father's training, used the crowd of students as cover while maintaining her path toward the shop. She noticed how the seemingly random movement of people and vehicles around her was creating a protective bubble, though she didn't yet understand that it was all part of her father's plan. Thunder, growing increasingly agitated, made his first major mistake. He ordered his men to abandon their subtle approach and move in directly. As they started their engines, multiple things happened at once. The traffic light turned red, the construction crew accidentally dropped a load of traffic cones, and 2 more police cruisers just happened to turn onto Main Street. Ray's phone lit up with another text from Calvin: FBI team just arrived. 5 minutes out. Everything was falling into place. The Serpents were now scattered, their coordinated plan in shambles, and they didn't even realize they were being herded exactly where Ray wanted them. Through the shop's windows, Ray saw Amy approaching, her pace steady and controlled. Behind her, Thunder and his men were growing visibly frustrated, their attempts to regroup hampered by the seemingly random obstacles in their way. The other Serpents were stuck 2 blocks back, trapped by the construction work and increased police presence. Thunder made his second mistake when he tried to create a distraction. He ordered one of his men to stage a confrontation near the construction site, hoping to draw attention away from Amy. But Calvin's team had anticipated this. The construction workers smoothly intercepted the biker, engaging him in a loud discussion about workplace safety that drew even more public attention. Amy was now less than a block from the shop. Ray could see the tension in her shoulders, but she was handling it exactly as they'd practiced in their safety drills. She wasn't running, wasn't showing fear, she was controlling the situation just as he'd taught her. Thunder, in a last desperate attempt, gunned his motorcycle toward the shop, only to find his path blocked by a newly arrived delivery truck, another of Calvin's team. The frustration on his face was evident as he realized that somehow, impossibly, every move he made was being countered before he could execute it. What the Serpents didn't realize was that they were now completely surrounded. Calvin's teams had quietly moved in behind them, the police were positioned at every intersection, and the FBI team was moments away. Their attempts to take Amy had led them straight into a carefully laid trap. Ray stepped out of his shop just as Amy reached the sidewalk in front. To anyone watching, it looked like a normal scene, a father greeting his daughter after school. But Ray's trained eye caught every detail: Thunder's increasingly desperate expression, the confused looks between the scattered Serpents, the subtle nods from Calvin's disguised team members. As Amy reached the shop's door, the final phase of Ray's plan began to unfold. Police cars suddenly appeared at both ends of the street, while Calvin's teams smoothly emerged from their cover positions. The trap was set, and the Serpents were about to learn why targeting this particular mechanic's daughter had been the worst decision they could have made. Thunder realized he'd lost control of the situation when he saw the unmarked vehicles smoothly blocking every possible escape route. His eyes darted from one position to another, finally understanding that the random obstacles he'd been facing all afternoon hadn't been random at all. They'd been deliberately orchestrated, and he'd walked right into it. Ray stood calmly in front of his shop, one hand on Amy's shoulder, the other holding his phone. The FBI team had arrived, their vehicles strategically positioned to complete the encirclement. The construction workers, delivery drivers, and various townspeople who had been seemingly going about their business suddenly shifted their stances, revealing themselves as trained professionals. "It's over, Thunder," Ray called out, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd commanded far more dangerous situations. "You made 3 mistakes. First, you didn't do your homework. A simple background check would have told you about my previous career. Thunder's face twisted with frustration as he finally understood who he was dealing with. The small-town mechanic image had been perfect cover for a former Navy SEAL. The serpents had walked into a trap set by someone who'd spent years planning operations far more complex than this. Second, Ray continued, you got predictable. I've been tracking your movements since you arrived in town. Every surveillance position, every planned escape route, you followed the same pattern you used in other towns. The FBI has been very interested in that pattern. The color drained from Thunder's face as he realized the extent of his failure. His men were now completely surrounded, with law enforcement on one side and Calvin's private security team on the other. The local police had positioned themselves strategically, evidence of Ray's careful coordination. And your third mistake? Thunder growled, knowing he was cornered but trying to maintain some semblance of control. You threatened my daughter, Ray said simply, the quiet steel in his voice making several of the serpents take an involuntary step back. That's when you lost any chance of succeeding. Amy stood tall beside her father, finally understanding why he'd spent years teaching her awareness and safety protocols. All those practice drills, the coded phrases, the alternate routes, they hadn't been paranoia. They'd been preparation. The FBI agents moved in smoothly, their coordination showing that this wasn't just about one small town's problem. The Black Serpents had been under investigation for months, suspected of running a nationwide operation of forced recruitment and illegal vehicle modifications. Ray's trap had given the FBI exactly what they needed, the entire leadership caught in the act. Thunder made one last desperate attempt to regain control. You don't understand what you're dealing with, he threatened, his voice rising. We have connections you can't imagine. Ray's slight smile stopped Thunder mid-sentence. Actually, I do understand. Those connections you're talking about? They're the ones who helped me set this up. Turns out, some of your business partners weren't too happy about drawing federal attention. They were quite helpful in providing details about your operation. The fight seemed to drain out of Thunder as he realized how completely he'd been outmaneuvered. Every angle had been covered, every contingency planned for. The small-town mechanic hadn't just defeated his plan, he'd dismantled his entire organization. As the FBI agents began making arrests, Ray turned to Amy, seeing the mix of shock and understanding on her face. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you everything, he said softly. But you handled it perfectly. Just like we practiced. Amy hugged her father tightly, finally understanding the depth of his love and protection. Those weren't just safety drills, were they? She asked. You were training me. Life has a way of teaching us to be prepared, Ray replied, watching as the last of the serpents were taken into custody. Your mother always said knowledge was the best defense. She'd be proud of how you handled yourself today. The afternoon sun was setting over Pine Grove as the last police cars pulled away. The town would have plenty to talk about in the coming days, but Ray knew the full story would never be known. His old contacts would make sure of that. The next few days in Pine Grove moved at a different pace. The town buzzed with speculation about what had really happened on Main Street, but the official story remained simple. A coordinated law enforcement operation had arrested a criminal motorcycle gang. Ray's involvement was minimized to that of a helpful local business owner, exactly as he preferred it. In the quiet of their home that evening, Ray and Amy sat at their kitchen table, the familiar smell of coffee filling the air. The questions Amy had been holding back finally spilled out. How long have you been preparing for something like this? She asked, wrapping her hands around a mug of hot chocolate. Ray considered his answer carefully. Since before you were born, he admitted. In my line of work, I saw how quickly things could change. When your mother and I decided to start a family, I promised her I'd always be ready to protect what mattered most. Amy thought about all the little things over the years that suddenly made sense, the strategic parking spots her father always chose, the routes he'd taught her to memorize, the way he could read people's intentions before they spoke. "Is that why we moved to Pine Grove?" "Partly," Ray nodded. "Your mother and I wanted a quieter life, somewhere you could grow up normally. But we also chose it because it was defendable, limited access points, clear sight lines, a community where strangers stand out." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Calvin, stopping by before heading back to his security firm. The two men embraced like brothers, and Amy realized there was so much more to her father's past than she'd ever imagined. "The FBI's finished processing the Serpent's phones and computers," Calvin reported, accepting a cup of coffee. "They found evidence linking them to similar operations in 12 other states. What they tried here, it wasn't the first time, but it'll definitely be their last." Amy listened as the two men discussed the technical details of how her father had orchestrated the trap. The tracking devices, the coordinated movements, the strategic positioning of Calvin's team, it had all been planned with the precision of a military operation. "I've got something for you," Calvin said, pulling out a small package. Inside was a new phone for Amy, one with enhanced security features and a direct line to Calvin's team. "Just in case," he smiled. "Though I doubt anyone else will be foolish enough to cause trouble here." As Calvin left, Amy noticed her father looking at an old photograph on the wall, one of him and her mother on their wedding day. "Mom knew about all of this, didn't she?" she asked softly. "She did," Ray smiled. "She was brilliant at logistics, you know. Half of our security protocols were her idea." "That analytical mind of yours? That's all her." The next morning, Ray's shop opened as usual. To anyone watching, nothing seemed different about the quiet mechanic and his daughter. But Amy saw everything with new eyes now. She noticed how her father always positioned himself with a clear view of the entrances, how he tracked customers' movements in the reflection of car windows, how he kept tools within easy reach. During their lunch break, Ray taught Amy how to spot surveillance, how to tell if someone was carrying a concealed weapon, how to memorize details without appearing to pay attention. It wasn't just about safety anymore, it was about sharing a part of himself he'd kept hidden for so long. "I don't want you to live in fear," he explained, watching her practice reading body language. "Knowledge isn't about being afraid, it's about being prepared. Your mother understood that better than anyone." As the week progressed, life in Pine Grove settled back into its routine. But subtle changes remained. The local police nodded to Ray with new respect. Calvin's security firm established a small office in town, officially for regional operations, but everyone knew it was another layer of protection for the community. Amy continued her normal activities, school, tutoring, helping at the shop, but with a deeper understanding of the world around her. She saw how her father had built their life like one of his engines, every part serving a purpose, everything working together seamlessly, protection wrapped in normalcy. A month after the incident, Pine Grove had changed in subtle ways. Tourists passing through might not notice anything different about the quiet town, but the locals had developed a new awareness. They looked out for each other more, paid attention to details they might have missed before. Ray's protection hadn't just extended to his daughter, it had awakened something in the whole community. One warm afternoon, while Ray and Amy worked together on a complex engine repair, a sleek black government vehicle pulled up to the shop. The FBI agent who stepped out was familiar, she'd been part of the team that took down the Serpents. Agent Chen had returned with news and a request. "The cases are closed," she informed them, sitting in Ray's office. "Thunder and his top lieutenants are facing federal charges. But that's not why I'm here." She pulled out a folder. "We've identified 3 other young people who were taken by the Serpents over the past 2 years. They're safe now, but struggling to readjust." Ray understood where this was heading. "You want me to help them? You've created something special here," Agent Chen gestured to the shop, the town. "A place where safety doesn't mean living in fear. These kids need that. They need to see it's possible to be both prepared and normal. Amy watched her father's face, recognizing the look he got when he was planning something complex. "Dad," she said softly, "remember what Mom always said about turning bad experiences into something good?" Ray smiled, remembering his late wife's wisdom. She'd always believed that every challenge was an opportunity to help others. "What did you have in mind?" he asked Agent Chen. The plan came together over the next few weeks. Ray's shop would offer an apprenticeship program, officially teaching mechanical skills to young people who needed a fresh start. Unofficially, it would help them rebuild their confidence and learn to protect themselves. Calvin's security firm provided additional support, turning the program into a comprehensive approach to recovery. The local community college even got involved, offering credits for the mechanical training portion of the program. The first 2 apprentices arrived in early fall. Amy took naturally to her role as a peer mentor, helping them adjust to life in Pine Grove. She saw in their eyes the same wariness she might have had if her father hadn't protected her, and she understood better than ever the gift he'd given her. One evening, while closing up the shop, Amy found her father looking through an old journal of her mother's. "She would have loved this," he said, showing Amy the pages filled with her mother's neat handwriting, designs for security systems disguised as ordinary objects, plans for teaching children self-defense through everyday activities. "She was teaching me too, wasn't she?" Amy realized. "All those games we used to play, the puzzles she made up." Ray nodded. "Your mother believed that the best protection wasn't just physical security, it was building confidence, awareness, and judgment. She designed most of the protocols we use in the apprenticeship program." The journal revealed another side of Amy's mother she'd never known, a brilliant security consultant who'd chosen to use her skills to protect others in subtle ways. The games and lessons she'd created for Amy were now helping other young people recover from trauma and rebuild their lives. As autumn progressed, the apprenticeship program flourished. The garage became more than just a place of business, it was a sanctuary where healing and learning happened alongside oil changes and tire rotations. The apprentices learned not just how to fix engines, but how to trust their instincts, how to be aware without being afraid, how to build a life that was both safe and free. For Ray, watching Amy guide these young people through their recovery brought a new kind of pride. She'd taken the protective instincts he'd passed down and transformed them into something even more valuable, the ability to help others protect themselves. Pine Grove had changed too. The town's residents had discovered that true security wasn't about locks and alarms, it was about community, awareness, and looking out for each other. What had started as one father's determination to protect his daughter had grown into something that touched countless lives. 1 year after the Black Serpents incident, Ray stood at the back of the Pine Grove Community Center, watching with quiet pride as Amy addressed the gathered crowd. She'd grown so much in the past year, not just in confidence but in her ability to help others find their strength. "When my dad first taught me to be aware of my surroundings," Amy began, speaking to the room full of families and young people, "I thought he was just being overprotective. Now I understand he was teaching me something more valuable, how to live confidently in an uncertain world." The community center was hosting the first graduation ceremony for the apprenticeship program. 6 young people, including the original apprentices, had completed their training. But they'd gained far more than just mechanical skills, they'd found a way to reclaim their lives. Ray's eyes drifted to the wall where photos of the program's progress were displayed. There was Amy teaching engine repair to a shy teenager who now ran the parts department. Another showed a group laughing during a community barbecue, their earlier wariness replaced by genuine joy. Each image told a story of healing and growth. The garage had evolved too. What started as a father-daughter operation had grown into a community hub. Ray had hired 2 of the graduates as full-time mechanics, while others had gone on to start their own businesses in town. The skills they learned went far beyond tools and engines, they carried with them the confidence to build secure, meaningful lives. Calvin, who'd become a regular visitor to Pine Grove, sat beside Ray at the ceremony. "You know," he said quietly, "what you've built here, it's exactly what the service was always meant to be about. Protecting people, but also teaching them to protect themselves." Agent Chen had returned for the graduation as well. The FBI had taken notice of the program's success, and similar initiatives were starting in other communities. Ray's approach, combining practical skills with security awareness, was becoming a model for helping young people recover from trauma. After the ceremony, Amy found her father in his usual spot in the garage, tinkering with an engine. "Dad," she said, holding up an envelope. "I got accepted to engineering school." Her eyes shone with excitement. "But I want to keep running the apprenticeship program too." Mom's journal. I found her plans for expanding it. Ray watched as his daughter spread out her mother's notes alongside her own designs. The similarities were striking, the same precise handwriting, the same innovative approach to solving problems. But Amy had taken her mother's ideas further, adding her own insights from working with the apprentices. "Your mother always said that true security comes from building something larger than yourself," Ray replied, recognizing how perfectly Amy had understood that lesson. "She would be so proud of what you've created here." The next morning, as Ray opened the shop, he reflected on how much had changed. The small-town mechanic's garage was still there, but it had become something more, a place where broken things were fixed, whether they were engines or lives. The security protocols he'd developed were still in place, but they'd evolved into a framework for teaching resilience rather than just protection. As the day's first apprentices arrived, Ray watched Amy greet them with the perfect balance of awareness and warmth that had become her trademark. She'd taken everything he'd taught her about security and transformed it into something even more valuable, the ability to help others find their own strength. The sound of engines and tools filled the air, mixing with laughter and conversation. Through the open garage doors, Ray could see Pine Grove coming to life for another day. The town had changed, but not in the way most people would notice. Its security didn't come from locks or cameras or defensive measures, it came from a community that had learned to look out for each other, to recognize danger without living in fear of it. In the end, what started as one father's mission to protect his daughter had grown into something that protected an entire community. Ray's legacy wasn't just the security protocols or the mechanical skills he'd passed on, it was the understanding that true safety comes from building connections, fostering awareness, and helping others find their strength. As he watched Amy lead a new group of apprentices through their morning routine, Ray smiled, knowing that his wife would have loved seeing how their daughter had taken their lessons about protection and turned them into something that helped heal the world, one person at a time.